Good evening, I'm Janice Longer, President and CEO of the Staten Island Museum. We welcome you here tonight. I'm honored to introduce a discussion with the artists and scholars who played a pivotal role in the development of the newest exhibition here, Taking Care, the Black Angels of CVU Hospital. I want to extend a special welcome to the nurses and families here with us tonight. So hello to Jenny. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, back in song filmmakers, Elissa, Blount, Moorhead, and Bradford Young. And scholar advisors, Debbie-Ann Paige, Dr. Rita Reynolds, and Lisa Holland. We are so grateful to our funding partners who understood the significance of this exceptional story and came forward to support this exhibition and the related programming. So deepest thanks to this evening's program sponsor, JPMorgan Chase & Company. And I'd like to acknowledge Barney Keller, who's here with us tonight. And also thank Monica Nation, who's the regional director. We'd like to thank the presenting sponsor of the exhibition, Staten Island University Hospital, Northwell Health. Lead sponsor is JPMorgan Chase & Company, and major support is provided by the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Lori M. Tisch Illumination Fund, and the Lily Auchincloss Foundation. So with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, the co-curator of the exhibition and director of curatorial affairs and programs for the Staten Island Museum, Rylee Eterginoso.
Thank you, Janice. Welcome, everyone. History was made on Staten Island in 1951 when a breakthrough treatment for tuberculosis was developed at CVU Hospital. Taking Care, the Black Angels of CVU Hospital is an exhibition highlighting the groundbreaking work, lives, and legacy of the nurses who broke racial barriers and risked their lives to care for patients and administer the clinical trials that forever changed the trajectory of this horrific disease. In conversation with the historic objects and archival images in this exhibition is Back in Song, an immersive film and art installation by Elissa, Blount, Moorhead, and Bradford Young that connects this important history to the contributions of Black women healers, healthcare workers, and caregivers throughout time. It was an honor and privilege to work on Taking Care with my co-curator, Gabriella Leone. This is an exhibition we hope you connect with personally and remember. Taking Care is about history, healing, heroism, and family. In fact, these themes came up again and again in recollections found in oral histories of nurses and patients alike, as well as in the heirlooms and cherished photographs families trusted us to display. They're represented in the network of descendants that author Maria Smilios and community leader and Black angel Miss Virginia Allen connected us with. These themes are also threads running through Back in Song. Gratitude was one of a series of values guiding the development of this exhibition. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and get it started with some questions. So we're going to start with Elissa and Brad. What is the past, present, and future of Back in Song?
I'm going to kill you, Brad. Let's see. The past is that for us, it's the same as the present, I think, which is about people who can't help but heal, from the Queen of Fuas to Stephanie Etienne. These are people who, it's a profession, but really it's something about how they've decided to be in the world. So, that's what motivated this. Initially this happened because someone came to Brad and wanted to talk about initially something that was actually quite the contrary, about the way that the medical system has subjected us to horrors for hundreds of years. And Brad had the willpower and the insight and the vision to say, let's flip it. And we started talking less about those tools and more about the Black technology of healing and how that was like just a much more interesting story. How despite that, we've managed to find healing in all sorts of things. So I think that's probably the past and the present and the future.
Well, I think the future is. I remember one time my wife, she's a midwife, and one time she was talking to some other midwives, and I was eavesdropping in, and she said, "Oh, what's important for us is to understand where our ancestors are, but with the herbs that they were buried with." And I think that's basically the work we're doing, is to try, in our way as visual artists, is to leave some residue, something. An affirmation to, our children, universally, our children, to let them know that these practices are alive and that they matter, and that it is important for us to seek balance, but to turn off one tap of information for a little bit and turn on the other tap, and that. But those two taps can be in conversation. But right now, because of the way energy flows, the way information flows, the way that sense of balance isn't there. And so it's really important for us to leave a kernel so that when they're ready to turn on that tap, that's more connected to their ancestors, it's more connected to the story of their ancestors, that they have a precedence. There's something from them to lean on, That's what the future. I'm hoping that's what the future looks like for Back in Song. As the work that the Black Angels have done is, if you'd asked them the similar question, and I'm sure that's what they would have communicated. They will communicate that to us, which is, we leave something behind so that this next generation can really reflect on our story.
Thank you. And when you're talking about a tap, it kind of reminds me of the experience of being in the piece too, with audio or imagery coinciding, not coinciding. How did the immersive environment and internal structure of Back in Song, how did that develop and come into play? Like the physical embodiment of Back in Song.
Yeah, that was, she's not gonna agree with me, but that's the way in which it's designed, the layout of it, the way you interact with it. Over years, as you develop these time-based film spatial stories, you come in with big ideas, and you see the win, and you see the diminishing value in that. And so some of the things that we would ignore in traditional cinema space, where it's a one-dimensional plane, you embrace here, because it gives the audience the ability to have multiple perspectives in the story. So, Elissa's always good about foreseeing the future. So she's always good about designing things in a way that gives a certain tension that allows you to move around the space in a way where you can bear witness to stories in layers, and so it was really her genius in that regard.
I do disagree. I think also too, one thing I remember us talking about was the scale of the healers, the women in the centerpiece, and how, they're kind of protecting you and giving you that feeling. We're constantly trying to have conversations around how art can be an apparatus, an actual apparatus for healing, slowing your heart rate and making you feel comfortable and feel joy so that your organs stay intact. So it that was something I know we thought about, and that sort of encompassing feeling with those images, that scale, and I think Rylee has done a great job. All of you have done a great job in making it do what we thought it could do. It feels like that in there. And I heard word that Virginia was happy about that, so we're done.
Agreed, thank you. So for the scholars, please describe the original research you contributed to Taking Care and where it's taking you next.
Me first, or? Okay. I guess I'm here. I worked on an exhibition, on an online exhibition called Apart Together, that was funded by the John Markey Fellowship at CSI, and that went up online a couple of years ago. And so that's when I really dug into sort of what primary sources are available about this history, so that people could learn about how to do history, how to learn about how to ask questions of what's available in order to tell a story that they're maybe not familiar with, or they maybe want to know more about than the little information that they have. And so I put that online exhibition together, and that's how I encountered a lot of the illustrious work of the other people on the panel, and so I'll let them tell you about that.
Okay, so one of the things that I love to do is if you say, hey, I can't find so-and-so, it's like, oh, it's on and popping. That is my thing. So just working with Gabby to like find people, uncover people, was one thing. And then sitting around, they decided to do this exhibit, and so they asked me to do some research about the nurses themselves, because I kept thinking they don't go to work and then come home, and they go to work and come home. They go to work, they come home, they go to church, they go swimming, they go to the library. So I kind of wanted to know who they were in the community, and so we thought we would look at them as church women. And so I got the Markey Scholarship as well for this year, and through that I was able to start to look at them in the community, and it expanded past the church. So I'm still working out the essays and things like that to tell their story in a bigger way.
Well, I mean, I've met the folks here, the wonderful folks here at the museum just recently, but I've actually been sort of doing research and looking into the nurses for over 10 years. So when I first got to Wagner, someone mentioned it to me, that there was a tuberculosis hospital, and all of the nurses who worked there were African American. And so at the time, maybe 2010, there was a guy who was the quote-unquote Seaview historian, and he was he'd go and he'd show you the little space at the campus, Seaview campus, and he would kind of show you what he wanted you to know, right? And so sort of looking in there, it was like, wow, this is fascinating. I mean, Lisa and I spent a lot of time there now, but I asked him about the nurses, and he couldn't tell me anything. Apart from the idea that the nurses were exclusively African American, except the supervisors were all white. And so while I was in this little museum that they have created there, I was looking around, I was like, wow, well, what's in all those drawers? And so it was like, oh, those are patient cards. And I was like, there's a lot of drawers there. And so, so at that time, there wasn't a lot known. There wasn't any place we could go for information. And so then 10 years later, I revisit, right, 2019, there was an opportunity to have a grant and present, right, some local history. And so I went to Lisa and I said, let's do Seaview. Let's look at the cards. And so, one of the things that started with sort of the interest in the Black Angels, my question was, well, what was sort of the bigger picture? How are they fitting into this place, right? And so, that's what we're doing right now, sort of understanding the context of the women, so the hospital, what it was, what it did, and how it kind of fit in on Staten Island. So, it's kind of the start of it. Although I think we get a long way before we're done, Lisa.
Yes, yes. So for me, I've worked with Rita on this for a number of years now, and I have a different angle because I am not a historian, I'm a librarian and an archivist, and so for me, it's what's in these records and how can we take care of these records and make sure people know these stories and we can keep these stories going for people 100 years from now, for the people who didn't know this existed, and when there's nobody else around to tell these stories, the documents will tell the stories, the research we're doing will tell the stories. And so we did end up, we're trying to preserve them by scanning them and digitizing them, but it's a very long process. And I guess what people don't necessarily realize, I get this question a lot just generally in the archives, is, oh, can't you just scan it? Well, yes, but then it's not of any use to you, right? It's just a document, you can't find it, you can't find the data, you can't find the information. So it's scanning, but then it's, okay, what does it say on this card? Their name, their age, what country they came from, how long they stayed there. It's all this data, and every card tells a story. It takes us a long time because we have to stop ourselves, because every time we go, we start scanning, we say, look at this person was only 6 years old, or here's a mother, and attached to the card is their newborn child, and so there's these all just fascinating stories to be told.
Thank you. And speaking of research, and this is a question for everybody, can you speak to a moment when you were surprised by or redirected by a piece of information or archival content that you came across in your research and development?
I have my standard answer for this, which is, as a non-medical person, I did not know you could get tuberculosis anywhere. It's a lung disease. I always knew it as a lung disease, but you can get tuberculosis in bones and organs and anywhere, and I just didn't know that.
I have to admit this, but historians, I think, just by nature are nosy people. And so, right, one of the things that we really struggled with is we while we're digitizing the cards and looking through books and all sorts of things, it was very difficult to think of them as just a number of people, right? We looked at names, and oh my goodness, look at this person they're originally from. Oh my goodness, he's 8 years old. Oh my God, he had a little brother who was here too. Is this the whole family? Oh my God, the whole family was here? And so we spent all of this time sort of looking at the details, right? But I think the thing that I thought was very interesting was that Seaview was a place where they did a lot of experiments on the patients looking for a treatment that was effective against TB, right? Because from the time it opens in about 1913 until, the antibiotics become available, they're doing all kinds of things to a very vulnerable, poor, sort of group of people who have no say. Right? There's no sort of, document that you sign that gives them permission. I mean, they just did what they wanted to do, and I thought that was very, wasn't surprising, but I didn't expect it to the degree that I saw, and that to me, I think, was kind of shocking.
I think for me, the history piece was looking at the nurses first, and then saying, well, what do I know about them? How do I get to know about them? How do I get to see them? And then, taking 12 different ways at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, what? I can't believe they did this. And so eventually there were so many women, there were so many people, I was like, well, maybe if I just focus on one or two to kind of tell the story of all of them, that might be helpful. So I kind of focused on one woman. Her name was Mary Dujon. And I said, well, she could be representative of the story. So I started to do her family's history, her genealogy, so to speak. And as I'm doing it, I was like, wait a minute, her name is Queen. And then I found in the book 272 that she's related, her people, she descends from the people who the Jesuits at Georgetown sold in order to keep the university alive. And so you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is another thing, right? This is another thing. And so as you're looking at these nurses, yes, they come from the South. Yes, they come from the Midwest. Yes, they come from Connecticut. And so when they get here, they're bringing their families with them. They're bringing their ancestors with them. And for me, that's always the thing that really sits with my spirit, is that I'm able to hopefully bring back and tell their stories. And not just the stories of the women, but the stories of their ancestors is what I'm hoping to be able to do.
I think to echo the idea about historians being nosy, one of my teachers liked to say that a good historian had to be comfortable reading other people's mail, and learning about their lives, and looking into their private records, I think in terms of a way that I was redirected, I think when I was first thinking about the story, I especially focused on the clinical trials for isoniazid in 1951, and nurses who were directly involved in those trials, right, were sort of the first passive people I wanted to know about. But then I realized in order to tell the story, there were all sorts of people and perspectives I had to seek out, right, from nurses who were there in the 1940s, nurses who were there in the 1950s, nurses who were there earlier, student nurses from some of the hospitals who were in partnership with CVU. One of them loaned her yearbook, Thurston Grooms loaned her yearbook from Harlem Hospital to the exhibition. And so just who did we have to get to know? Because I feel like historical research is a lot about encountering people, meeting sort of historical friends, if you will. And so who did we have to get to know in order to have a lens or perspective onto how CV worked and who was there and who helped to run it? So I think that my redirection was an expanding of scope.
I mean, if that question doesn't immediately pop out, I got another one for you.
The whole thing is revelatory for us, you know. I mean, we three of us have worked in tandem when we did the project, and Simone Lee did the nurse, you know, because of that and because of other things we read, we knew, of course, in an instance where, you know, race is a factor and class is a factor, Black women will still take care. And that's not new, and that was, so it's revelatory, but it's also like, yeah, I mean, that's how it is, and it's always astounding in the context of a history where they, you know, we know that they were not afforded basic rights in other spaces, but it didn't impede their work and didn't impede, I think, to some extent it had to also, it didn't impede their hearts because, you know, something that people were dying from and they literally risked their lives. So, you know, I'm always just interested in that dynamic because that means that they're vibrating at a level that probably most of us could barely understand if you're not so inclined, you know, on a spiritual level. So, you know, it's sort of revelatory because every time you see it or read about it, you're like, whoa, that's superhuman, but it's also what we know.
Thank you. And just to piggyback off of that, you know, in terms of adding new content, so like bringing back in song to the museum and bringing the story of the Black Angels, the history of Black Angels into the piece, how did filming and including the portraits of Miss Curleen Bennett, Miss Virginia Allen, and Miss Lucille Herring into that piece, did it change it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, our our process is it's a generative process, so it's it's a living process. So, I kind of when I was a student in school, I always dreamt that we as image makers would have a generative process like the show or project, or where we find ourselves in a situation and we equip with this equipment, this knowledge, this understanding. We would journey out into the world and photograph and speak to folks in the community who have done wonderful things, and from somebody who just planted a seed to somebody who healed someone. So, our process, it also engages with the archive, right? So we also, one of the things that's really important in our process is that we engage. In this instance, we worked with a set of really radical archivists from the UK who have access to, a large archival treasure trove of things that some we didn't know were related, don't generally know are going to be related. It's oftentimes prompting them with ideas, and then they go out into their world, which is a very, it's a very ominous, seems like a very ominous, infinite world of information. They go into that place and they excavate, and it's beautiful watching them excavate from these prompts and bring material to us. And then after that, we then have to either sift through that information, or we hand it to our editor, who's also as a generative partner who's working in real time, who's making changes in real time from feeling, from conversation. And then that person, Stephanie St. Tosh, who we work with often, then decides this is the final material to go into the piece. So I say all that to say that, in a lot of ways, the way in which we bring new material into the piece isn't intellectual in that way. It's more, what would we call it? It's it's organic. We don't. It's dutiful. If you understand what I mean, like the spirit tells us, so someone tells us there are these black women called the Black Angels, and they've done this work. And the first thing we say was, of course, because through our journey of capturing, we understand that there are these scions that exist, and they're in every corner of our life, in every corner of our community, and so. Really, at that point, we're just workers. We go out and we just sit with them. We have conversation or no conversation, and we photograph them. And so in that sense, the piece really is. It makes sense for us to be here because it's part of a chain of transmission of information and work that we have been engaging in and building the piece, and that it's part of hopefully extending a chain of transmission that we hope to continue on with a piece that's so. That we hope is generative.
Thank you. So this question is for the scholars. So when you talk about research, about gathering, about finding out, I mean, your passion is electric. It feels like detective work when I'm overhearing Gabby and Debbie talking about it at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then this led to this, and this led to this, and I'm just like riveted. It feels like you're personally inspired. It feels like even mission driven. Do you have personal goals as a historian or an archivist? And how did the research you do for the show connect to these goals at all?
Okay, I'll start. I think that as a born and raised Staten Islander and archives manager at Staten Island Museum, that I certainly am fascinated by the stories of my hometown. I want people to know about Staten Island and its richness, its depth, its breadth. And I also think I'm always looking to tell evidence-based stories. I want to show people how the sausage gets made. I want to make sure people understand where information comes from and how they can dig into it themselves and join us in this crazy, these 2 a.m. We want everyone to be up at 2 a.m. doing census research. And so you'll see that in the exhibition itself, you'll notice there are some census pages on the wall so that you understand where how we can say that the population of Seaview Hospital has changed over time. Of course, in interacting with the objects, in interacting with the documents that are on display, I hope you understand or gain a new perspective in how we're making some of the conclusions that we're talking about in interpretive text, and where you can go to look if you're so inspired, because there are definitely more stories to be told, and we need all of the hands to tell them.
I think for me, so anyone who's heard me speak knows I've said this a gazillion times. I was born in Jamaica. I migrated to Staten Island on my 5th birthday. I grew up in Staten Island. I went to PS 12, I went to 49, I went to Brooklyn Tech for a short stint, and I came back to Staten Island and I finished up high school in New York. And throughout this time, here's what I know about Black history. Martin Luther King had a dream, and Harriet Tubman saved millions of slaves. And so, you know, at one point I got hooked on genealogy while we were, my husband and I were stationed in Puerto Rico in the 90s. And I thought I would never find anything about me, but I love, again, you know, this nosiness that's the thread that binds us. And so, you know, I'm looking and I go, wait a minute. I start to see little bits and pieces of Staten Island. And I go, I want to talk about Staten Island. I need people to know. My daughter was stopped in the ferry at one time, and the person said, what? You live on Staten Island? Black people live here? And I say to you that people of color, Black people of African descent have been here since 1640. And so those stories need to be told. And it's my job at 2 a.m. to tell those stories. You know, it's my job to get that out there into the universe. And so then Gabby will tell you that I also say that Staten Island is the Forrest Gump of history. Like, that is my thing. That I'm gonna get that trademark, because if you ask about an era, if you ask about a time, if you ask about a thing, I can evidentially put Staten Island in that space. And that's important, because, you know, there's this narrative of forgotten borough. Who forgot it? I didn't forget it. We're here. We live here. We breathe here. We have families here. The story of Staten Island needs to be told, and I think that is the biggest driving force for me in the things in what I do and how I do the history.
Yeah. You know, I'm a New Yorker by birth, and not a lot of people who live in New York now can say that, right? But my scholarship is not in the North, it's in 19th century South Carolina. And one of the things, when you asked about sort of, you know, connectedness, and I think the thing that really fascinated me, or I found fascinating about the Seaview nurses, is this idea that they're part of the Great Migration, right? You know, so I do 19th century African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina. When slavery is abolished, the question is, where do they go, right? And so they come up here, right? You know, is life better for them up here? They're fleeing the South. They're fleeing Jim Crow South. They come to Staten Island. Is it better up here? You know, and so that's a question that's yes and no, right? As I started looking at the nurses and interacting with them and hearing their stories, as just a historian who's looking just at the documents, our first question is, wow, you know, they're working in a place that's really contagious, right? Okay, that doesn't sound great, but on the other hand, you know, they decide to do this. The salary is much better for them. They're making choices. They're being very careful. They're real professionals. And so, you know, I'm always why? What, you know, what happens to these incredible women, right? And so that's you know, very much like Debbie-Ann, you know, this question of African American history on Staten Island. You know, you have, you know, history of groups of people who are here, families that are here, 100, 200 years ago, they've stayed here, they've created a community. And then you have those who are grafted in, right, who come later and contribute, astonishing things to the history of African Americans on Staten Island, but just Staten Island history in general, right? And I think, this is, for me, I'm still kind of bringing African American history together as opposed to something in South Carolina and something on Staten Island. But just in general, how do these stories, these experiences contribute to American history? And I think that the role of sort of medical history and tuberculosis, right, as such a horrible disease that kills scores of people, right, for these women to step forward and do what they did, I think is an astonishing story that really must be told.
I think similar to my co-panelists, in terms of mission, it is just telling these stories. So, and finding the information and making sure it's right. So, when we were getting everything finalized, Gabby had emailed me and said, "Can you find these 5 or 6 nurses?" She was doing some other stuff, and we just said, "Okay, let's research these people, make sure we know where they were born, where they died, who they were," and so it was. You can't fail at this, right? You have to find out who these people are. And so we go to the sources and we go to the census and we go to the Staten Island Advance and find a whole profile or an obituary or a death record or, something that leads to something else. So we know this woman was a nurse at Seaview. And so we find the name and we Google the name, or we go to Ancestry.com and find the name. And then you find the death record, and then you find, in the 1940 census, it said they lived here, and this is their age, and it says they were a nurse. So this must be the correct person, and let's make sure we have the right people and we're telling the right stories.
So one of the questions, this is for Elissa and Brad, one of the questions posed by Back in Song is, to what degree can the experience of watching a film and the collaborative process of making one become a form of healing in itself? Can you describe a key moment or a few key moments in the development of Back in Song that particularly felt like a salve? I knew you were going to pass it to me.
When Brad passes me things, that's when it feels like a salve. No. No, a couple of things. One is, we both have families. We have moved into an intentional community situation, live down the street from each other, and, moments where Brad's then toddlers are setting up shots. And it's part of what how we want to work. We want to be together, be with people we love, and make things that we love about topics and people that we love. So, being able to do that work and not have to be separated from the most important people in our lives is a salve, and it's what we want. We work in a pretty rough industry, and we want to complicate that, and we want to subvert that roughness, and make them yield to our cultural ideas and our cultural, and I mean culturally, I mean every part of every way of life, ideas of peace and calm and all of that stuff. So, that's one thing. And then also I think something that I think Brad has incredible mastery around is really collaborating. Like, I think people have ideas about what collaboration is, and it's really just, some of it is assembly line. Right? I do my part, you do your part, and everybody shuts up, and you do what I say because I know this part. And then there's like, some people who are like, you do this, and then I'm gonna make it better, and then I'm gonna throw you under a bus, and there's all these ways that I think people think they're collaborating and they're not. And then there's relenting and relinquishing and knowing that there's something way more important than your initial thought. And so, I was thinking about the music right? Because like what Brad is saying is one of the few people who, or we both will talk about the editor as a collaborator. A lot of people, talk about editors as an after, even describing them as part of the post-production process as if they're not part of the production process. And also, the work, the score, Esperanza Spalding, the great Esperanza Spalding, did the score, and there's something about trust and relenting in any kind of making creative design process that people give lip service to, but they're not really trying to do that. And I think the first thing you have to do is trust. And so if you're in a trust thing, then you can play around a lot because you're not tied to the outcome in the same way. So, we literally just handed the stuff over, right, to Esperanza, and we're like, whatever you think. And she scored it, and we didn't give her comments. I mean, imagine giving her notes. I mean, I guess somebody does, but not us. And we knew she put her love on it, and it just keeps going on. So, AJ describes it as like instead of sort of building, it's passing the ball, but then passing it back, so the energy is going backward and forward. And in the making process you were talking about too, the additive and adding, like early on we were like, wow, imagine this can just grow and be in different spaces. It didn't present itself, it's been a couple other places and that didn't happen. But then when this came up, I said to Brad, that I didn't say anything about Back in Song necessarily at first. At first I said, that there's these nurses and about this story. Have you heard this story? I didn't know the story. Rylee told this story. And so that is the impetus. And so the nurses who are on Earth and who are ancestors were telling us, like, we want to be a part of that energy passing too. And so, we tried to make a way. And all of that, everything I'm trying to describe basically is healing for us. We get a lot more, I think, out of it than even anybody who gets to watch it. We really are transformed by being able to be a part of it. And the last thing I'll say is another part that was also a solve and a practice in humility, as if being parents isn't enough. We a couple of times had to redo some reshoots, and we and we're a mess because we don't play around with our elders either. So we were like, oh, we don't want to, we're taking people's time, and but we also we were like, we needed to spend more time, because then some of it actually was okay. We thought it wasn't, and it was. So we came back anyway, and then I brought my daughter, and then we got to bring another person from our extended family, Mark. So you gotta relent to that. So for me, I'm an earth sign. I like to control things. But there's always every reminder that I have absolutely no control is very healing for me, and the work hopefully is guiding and pushing us.
Yeah, I was gonna I was maybe two stories, no, be very brief, but one that was very personal for me was we had this crazy idea about because as we're making two, we're actually experimenting. So we're creating a workshop where we have these ideas and we use the filmmaking process as a workshop to see if they actually work. So we had color construction paper that we just bought at CVS, and we laid it all out on the table. And we told, at the time, my two sons to pick the colors that they connected to the most, and tape them on our back window of our house, and then photograph them. So it was humbling. It was beautiful for me, not just as a parent, but also just as an observer of a certain thing that was at play, which was imagination. And one of the things that I have to remind myself, and as storytellers, that's the power we have the most, is that our imagination. And I think the thing that's the salve about all of this is, watching my children, for whatever psionic, epigenetic reason, they picked these colors that were telling them something, and they gave them to us as makers, and they then made us put them on the wall and we photographed them. That was bearing witness of an imagination. And all through the piece, what you see is people who have used the imagination to elevate or move something forward. Like, none of this stuff that the Black Angels did or have left for us is without imagination. It took imagination in order to resolve or crystallize certain ideas, You have to imagine the impossible. It's very Che Guevara anyway. You have to imagine the impossible you have to imagine the impossible in order to get to a certain synthesis of an idea. So watching that at play was really wonderful, because what it says to me is that, we don't really have to do much, right? We don't really have to do much. All we have to do is pose the question. And as filmmakers, as healers, we just have to pose the question, and then certain folks who have the facility to do it. We were talking earlier about how we see our children, and my oldest son is now in the same program at the same institution where her daughter, who's like my right hand, her daughter's like my right hand partner. But we know something about these two characters. They have same birth signs. They're going to be the type of folks in the world who are going to service ideas. They don't have the spiritual constitution to be in the fire, but they will help instigate the fire. There'll be a rock in that, and they'll service the making of the fire. So just watching in our sequence, I'll leave it at this, just knowing that there's a connection between, the Black Angels, the God People, Cecil Taylor, you know what I mean? And this all connected, and I'm back to imagination. It is connected. It's all connected, right? Because there's a journey that our historians have reminded us of. We're on a journey that completely connects us. But we also can, even if there's not a direct connection, we have to imagine there's a connection, and imagining that there's a connection, we can lay out, we felt compelled to lay out back in song the way that we laid it out. And, we were less worried about the milestones of time and feet on the ground and who was there and who wasn't there. We were all there at the same time. We had been there. If we weren't there, we were thinking about being there. So that's really been, and again, this is a very generative thing, right? I'm hoping that we never finish this project, or this project goes on, we can pass it on to Sunny or Olukai, my son, or Sunny, her daughter, or Ziggy, her son, who's also an incredible filmmaker as well. We can pass it on to them so that whatever thing we've gotten out of it so far can be given and restored. And also, one thing I was thinking about too, in me understanding things is also a salve for me, is that when doing this work, because we work in an industry, and an industry is an industry, right? Certain things milestones have to be met in order for it to be efficient and for folks to give you money to do it. But it's beautiful to not have to engage with that. And it's beautiful to know that the work that you're actually doing is actually going into the archive. Because basically all we are, we're fraudulent archivists. We're not really, we're clumsy archivists. We just imagine that, if we do 5 shots, maybe the 5 shots that we make can go into the archive, So really for us, it's the capturing of the faces that says that we were here, they're here, there's radical community birth workers, and then there's the Black Angels, they're here, and that hopefully that'll get placed in the registry, and people can bear witness later.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Lisa. This question is for everyone, really. What questions were posed during your process or research that remain unanswered?
The short answer is all of them. I think I'm still looking to see who they are. depth and breadth of all of them, right? If we have 300 nurses, and then they have family members, and then there are the patients, and then I always say that Seaview has fed Staten Island. Like that's the thing that I say. So if you worked at Seaview, if you were in the janitorial staff, if you were the cooks, if you washed the sheets, everybody was taking a chance. Everybody was trying to do something, and I want to know who all of them are. I am that nosy. Like that is my thing, because I think their stories are so important.
I was gonna say the same thing. I think that there are names to know still, and I think even just the position of Seaview Hospital in sort of these larger contexts that Rita was referring to, and Debbie and Lisa, in terms of the hospital system, in terms of the Great Migration, in terms of many different stories. I think there are almost innumerable stories to tell about Seaview Hospital, so there are many, many questions to ask.
And I think one thing that always sort of, as we're looking at all these people and whose story should we tell? And so I think that's maybe sort of the overreaching, yes, the nurses, of course, and the people who work there, but the patient, thousands and thousands and thousands of patients. And so I think we have to think about, do we pick someone who's representative? As Debbie said, she looked at someone who could be representative of the nurses. Do we find some patients who could be representative? But also remember, they're all individuals, and they all had families, and they all had, people who left them there, the children, right? Their parents had to leave them there, or just so many stories. And I think we just have to remember that we can never tell them all, but we have to think about what to tell them.
I think it's really interesting, the sort of lack of material on the nurses themselves.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And we've been looking, sort of what was the process they went through to hire them? Did you just have to be a African American woman who was a nurse, right? But in addition to that, right, sort of the nurses, I'm so interested in the personal stories. I mean, I would argue I'm a social historian. How do these women interact with people that they knew didn't have long to live, right? And that sort of, how tuberculosis would play out in the lives of little children, right? As Debbie-Ann was saying, it wasn't about them, getting to work every day, and that was what they did, and that was who they are. That was their job, right? But these nurses, had to take these stories home and, share it with their families, right? And how does one deal with, death? How does it impact them? And then what do you do if one of your colleagues, another nurse, gets tuberculosis, right? How do you deal with that person, right? And then, all of a sudden, what if you got it, right? And those kinds of stories, what are they telling their colleagues? What are they telling their families who live, in Georgia? And they have a cousin who says, I want to come up there because you make good money, and I'm trained and I'm a nurse now. Should I come and work with you at Seaview? What did they tell them, right? And I'm really kind of interested in those kinds of stories, because I think that they're really representative of what is going on. That's the human story, right, of Seaview. That's not the scientific story, right? That's not about doctors who are looking to make their careers, who are looking, for a cure because, they want to be known, right, as that person. I just think the stories of the people on the ground are so much more interesting, because that tells the story of Staten Island, right? That tells the story of the Black Angels, right? That tells the story of Seaview Hospital, the place.
Thank you.
and I think that that's a good point to transition to a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, we can sort of, there's Vincent in the house if he wants to run around with the wireless mic, or you want to handle that. I think we have someone saying, yeah.
I was interested to follow up on that, as opposed when as a social historian, social science historian, and I've been reading a lot always for 25 years of medical historians, and the things you said were experimental or for poor people were the same practices done to George Washington, to the presidents Lincoln, Gardner, and McKinley, because that was the highest state of medical practice because of their ignorance of what they had to accomplish. I mean, their ideas are woefully not able to deal with any of this. Yet they had to do something, and the Civil War just stopped, and things. So it's not necessarily medicine is experimenting on these people. It's a condition where the nurses are bringing forth practices of Florence Nightingale on science-based medicine and evidence-based, and despite their failings, are educating them. And it educates them in the quarantine when the Irish came, and they were treated like tuberculous patients. And so it's a story of really over and over, and it's a great, where people rise to great heroic efforts. And it's in this context, it's the Black Angels. And Staten Island is the gem and epicenter of the municipal hospital system, which brought forth the quarantine, which brought forth Seaview Hospital, which brought forth Willowbrook, which was supposed to be the state of the art, all based on this flawed medicine. So, I mean, it's a universal story, and it's really, by telling the individual story, you really get the heroic heart of it at that moment in that time that can really be transformative. And that's what I fell in love with the book many months ago when I read it, and that's what I got out of it. But to make statements or like criticizing or methods of doctors or things, I don't think, with our lenses we can, looking backwards, but at the moment, I don't think that's a right thing to do. I think it's better to elevate the accomplishments of women who brought forth medicine and that great medical practices of the time.
Yeah. Well, so I think, thank you for your comments. I don't know if we can compare George Washington, Abraham Lincoln with people who are in Seaview.
Right,
okay?
but
Hang on a second.
But the practices were the same by
Well,
Benjamin Rush.
but that is different. I mean, we're talking about something different. Hold on one second. Let me just get to my thought here. One of the ways we discovered that Seaview patients were being used as guinea pigs was from an article, a letter that was sent to the Seaview Tuberculosis Journal. And so what you had is you had doctors coming from all over the world, and they were working at Seaview, whether they were from Columbia or NYU, Johns Hopkins, Edinburgh Hospital, or Edinburgh University, I should say, were coming to Seaview. And so in one of the journal articles, a doctor at Seaview was explaining a procedure that he had used that was successful, and he was celebrating his advance. Somebody wrote to the journal and chastised them for not following proper procedure, right? Another doctor in another place. And so apparently during the time that they're doing this, and I think it was in the 1930s,
20s or 30s.
yeah,
Yep.
their own community is challenging them in terms of the procedures that they are doing. Okay, so I'm not making sort of, a statement that's out of context, but we're following the history, right? So one of the things that Lisa says is that we're finding evidence, right? And we're not sort of just, making up things, but this is coming from their own colleagues
Right,
and
because
chastise
in
them.
1920 was the evolution of medicine through the Flexner Report that started the medical profession to be science-based. And that
Well, before
led
that.
to the criticism you're revealing in the 30s. Because now you don't have the individual black nurses alone trying to overcome these great men of science. Now you have even the medical profession being educated in medical schools at 1920. So what you saw was, historically, the transition from the therapeutic, heroic therapies that lasted from the 1700s all the way through the 1950 practices at Willowbrook. And in the 1920s, and that's the practice that all those presidents had taken, and all the Civil War casualties had gone. That's the way they were all treated. So 1920 is a pivotal moment where now actually conscious and science evidence-based medical practice entered the world.
Right, well,
And so that's why you're seeing that in sort of criticism.
right, well,
And that's what gives us the great things we have now.
well, I
But
would
the nurses
argue,
fought all that.
I would argue though,
I'm just-
that
You
sort
don't have
of
to argue. I'm
the
just
idea,
saying that
yeah, no,
because-
I'm,
You know,
I would also say that this idea of using sort of vulnerable people as your guinea pigs does not start in 1920. Hang on a second. You know, in the creation of medical schools in places like Charleston, South Carolina, right, in Baltimore, where they need cadavers, right, for the students to work on, you know, they're buying slaves, right? They're having masters donate the cadavers of dead slaves, and it's the slave population who basically is saying, we're not going to work, we have a problem if you give my mother, right, to the medical school. You know, so this is not, you know, we're talking about a group of people who have no choice. You know, the people who do have a choice, but those are different groups of people, right?
But I'm saying the choices, the therapy that they're given, Washington, Gardner, or McKinley, is the same sort of cutting out, probing, all the therapies, poison, strychnine that would have given in the municipal hospital system. And if you looked at the therapies of the hospitals, you would find them the same therapies that were given to people like McKinley or Gardner in the 1880s when he was shot.
So let me say this.
I'm just saying,
So let me say this. I hear what you're saying, right?
it wasn't any better medicine.
I hear what you're saying, but there's a way to look at this through, and it depends on the lens that you're filtering this through. Right. I'm gonna filter this through another lens, right? Because the people who you are alluding to in terms of medicine, you're not mentioning people of color, right?
That's why I did that.
So-
purposely.
Right,
Because I'm saying it's not-
but I'm saying to you that it always is, right? So everything in the United States,
Yes.
everything here has to be filtered through this lens of race.
Right.
So when we look at these things to imagine the way that they would treat McKinley or Washington is quite different than they would treat other people, especially those of African descent. So I think it becomes a difficult argument for you to make to say, well, you just have to look at them as the medicine then was terrible, and now that they've worked their way through this medicine. Hang on one second. So through that, right? So through that, black women, whether they were nurses in the scientific way or whether they were nurses in the community in the tradition of their ancestors, have been doing medicine, and it wasn't junk medicine. It wasn't experimental medicine. It was medicine that they understood about who they were, that had been transferred and transferred and transferred for generations.
Midwives.
So not just midwives, but through this whole, so see, what I don't want us to do is to parse out and name and drop into little pieces what we think they were. They were much bigger than that. And so for us to look at scientific medicine as the end all be all, we dismiss these women and these men who that's what they have been, like they were born to do that, and they had been doing it. When we look at how these what was it, 1796, there was an African American or a man of African descent, I'll say it that way, who brought immunizations to the United States, and Cotton Mather's like, what? No, we don't want to have nothing to do with that. No, that's crazy. And it's not until another European decides that it's okay that now we're going to embrace it. This is a difficult thing. I think when you say she can't look at something that way, you did. You said she shouldn't look at it that way. And I'm saying to you that everyone has a space and a way to examine things.
Yes, that's what I said.
And her perspective is very different than your perspective.
Right.
And so therefore, when we do this and we have these arguments back and forth, no. So what we say, when we say argument, it's a scholarly way to interrogate information. So as we interrogate the information differently, we need to understand that people of African descent bring something very different to the table, and how we manage it.
Yes.
That's all I'm saying.
Yes, we have a question back there. Thank you so much.
Hi, I don't have a question.
Yeah.
I wanted to pass this to Brad, but I also want to add another lens, which is the gender lens, and anybody who has read anything, and weren't they practicing medicine in Egypt, but whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But anybody who's read anything about experimentation in particular, we live in Baltimore, knows that in New York, Baltimore, places like that, Black and Irish women who were occupying a similar status at that point, so Black people were experimented on, not just because of vulnerability and access. There was actually an aggressive movement until the 1980s. And on top of all of that, the one thing that I don't know if I heard from you from a science standpoint or a historical standpoint or a social standpoint is consent. So McKinley, I'm sure, was not in a situation where he was not giving consent. In the situations that you read about in Medical Bondage and all these other books, consent was a vital piece. So
Informed consent.
informed consent.
Yeah.
I just think, I think the one thing that I always have to remind myself is that there were actually Black people that didn't care either. There were actually Black folk that had imagination and created mythological landscapes and healing landscapes that didn't check into any of the stuff that is on the surface, right? So that's one of the pleasures of being a filmmaker, is that I don't have to be historically accurate. I could care less about history. History doesn't mean anything to me. I'm committed to making up things, and one of the things, fabulations, and the thing that we love about Queen Afua, the thing that we love about Dr. Africa, the thing that we love about Dr. Sebi, is that all of these things we're debating did not matter to them at all. Right? These weren't, and they won, and they healed many of us and are still healing us. So I think it's worth mentioning that resistance is a very interesting thing, that in spite of the common thread of the American medical institution, which is brand new, and this is the discovery of making back in song. I know for Lisa and I, I'm being informed by my wife, who's very informed and a historian and a birth worker, and is that even with her, we have to say, yes, the history tells this story. But while the strand of history is about cutting us and bleeding us and severing us and doing all of that, there was another story on the other side, which was, you will not cut us.
Yeah.
There's stories in our herbs, right? We're not even interested in your narrative. We're not even interested in your concepts, the playground that you've created with our body. Doesn't count, doesn't matter for us. I think it's worth just in this forum to say that it's actually beautiful to remember that there are actually folks that just are completely not interested in your mythology at all. You know, that we've created our own bearing, our own mythology that has saved us, that's kept us healthy, that's kept us in this room now.
Okay, we have time for just one more question.
No, I don't have a question, so I applaud you all for this magnificent project. So, talk about history. So, Gabby, you always teach me something. Debbie-Ann, like whenever I talk to you, I learn something different. So, I'm sitting here and you're talking about Africans coming to Staten Island many years ago. So, I'm from Liberia, West Africa. I was born in Liberia. So, of course, I Googled to see when the first Liberian was here. It says 1970. So, I may be wrong. Google might be wrong, right? So, 1970. This is my year of birth, right? So I know I look young, but I'm not. And I'm thinking at night at the exhibit, I meet Miss Bennett, right? Think about the people behind the nurses behind the story. She spent years in Liberia, but it gets even scarier. She was in the same county I was born in 1970. You believe this, right? So I was fascinated by her hat, not even her story. So I see the hat, and I start to talk to her, and I read her profile. And she says Liberia. And I said I was born there. And here it gets even more interesting. The doctor who delivered me in 1970, she worked with. So you talk about the ladies behind, the nurses behind the story. That's the connection. So now I live in Staten Island, I went to college here, all that. But without this project, I would not have known I made a connection with someone who was actually in the same place with me many years ago. And my mother passed away, it'll be 3 years. And I'm thinking to myself, if she was alive, she would have story to tell with Miss Bennett because that's the connection. And I'm pretty sure they crossed paths at one time in Liberia. So thank you guys for this.
I think that's all that we have for tonight. We welcome you to come upstairs for some refreshments to continue the conversation. Thank you so much. And we hope that you enjoyed everything.